Something quite unusual happened on that day. The church started right on time, just like it does without a doubt. And everything was all just fine. So it came time to let us out. The preacher, he kept preaching. He told us, I have one more thing to say. Children, before you think of me, you better think about the judgment day. And now, everyone got nerve. Everyone was hungry. Everyone was wondering what was the next thing he would do. And the preacher kept preaching. He said, now, I'll remind you if I may, you all better pay attention. I might decide to preach all day.
So, Lyle Lovett. I don't know if you're a Lyle Lovett fan, but it's one of my favorite songs. I sent it to a friend of mine that preaches like an hour and a half every week, literally, and he didn't get the message. But I wanted to give you a little warning on account of it's already kind of late. This message, it's one of those typical ones where you think that there's nothing in there until you begin to look at things. So I cut down as much as I could, but just hang in there this morning. The first thing that I'd like to do is I have a video. It's about 5 minutes, and it's someone reading Ezra chapter 2. I did not want to pass over the chapter, and I didn't want anybody to get distracted because there's a lot of names in succession that are difficult to pronounce. So we're going to play this little video, which is actually video in name only, but it's someone reading Ezra chapter 2. And while he's reading, try to pick out familiar names or familiar places and just listen to the text and try to see what you can get out of it. So Sharon, if we could play that.
Had taken captive to Babylon, they returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his own town, in company with Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Seraiah, Reelaiah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rahum, and Baanah. The list of the men of the people of Israel: the descendants of Parosh, 2,172, of Shephatiah, 372, of Ara, 775, of Pahath Moab, through the line of Jeshua and Joab, 2,812, of Elam, 1,254, of Zatu, 945, of Zakai, 760, of Bani, 642, of Bebai, 623, of Azgad, 1,222, of Adonikam, 666, of Bigvai, 2,056, of Adin, 454, of Ater, through Hezekiah, 98, of Bezai, 323, of Jorah, 112, of Hashum, 223, of Gibar, 95, the men of Bethlehem, 123, of Neotophah, 56, of Anathoth, 128, of Osmaveth, 42, of Kiriath Jearim, Kephirah, and Beeroth, 743, of Ramah and Geba, 621, of Michmash, 122, of Bethel and Ai, 223, of Nebo, 52, of Magbish, 156, of the other Elam, 1,254, of Harim, 320, of Lod, Hadid, and Ono, 725, of Jericho, 345, of Senaa, 3,630. The priests, the descendants of Jedaiah, through the family of Jeshua, 973, of Immer, 1,052, of Pashur, 1,247, of Harim, 1,017. The Levites, the descendants of Jeshua and Kadmiel, through the line of Hodaviah, 74. The singers, the descendants of Asaph, 128. The gatekeepers of the temple, the descendants of Shallum, Ater, Talmon, Akub, Hatita, and Shobai, 139. The temple servants, the descendants of Ziha, Hasupha, Tabaoth, Keros, Sayaha, Padon, Lebanah, Hagabah, Akub, Hagab, Shalmai, Hanan, Gidel, Gahar, Reaiah, Rezin, Nakoda, Gazam, Uzzah, Pasea, Pasai, Azna, Meonim, Nephusim, Bakbuk, Hakupha, Harhur, Bazluth, Mehida, Harsha, Barkos, Sisera, Tema, Neziah, and Hatepha. The descendants of the servants of Solomon, the descendants of Sotai, Hasophereth, Paruda, Ja'ala, Darkon, Yidel, Shephatiah, Hatil, Pokereth, Hazabaim, and Ami. The temple servants and the descendants of the servants of Solomon, 392. The following came up from the towns of Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Karub, Adon, and Emer, but they could not show that their families were descended from Israel. The descendants of Deliah, Tobiah, and Nekoda, 652. And from among the priests, the descendants of Hobaiah, Hakkoz, and Barzillai, a man who had married a daughter of Barzillai the Gileadite, and was called by that name. These searched for their family records, but they could not find them, and so were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. The governor ordered them not to eat any of the most sacred food until there was a priest ministering with the Urim and the Thummim. The whole company numbered 42,360, besides their 7,337 men servants and maidservants, and they also had 200 men and women singers. They had 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys. When they arrived at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, some of the heads of the families gave freewill offerings toward the rebuilding of the house of God on its site. According to their ability, they gave to the treasury for this work 61,000 drachmas of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, and 100 priestly garments. The priests, the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants settled in their own towns, along with some of the other people, and the rest of the Israelites settled in their towns.
How many of you here skip over that chapter? H. Williamson, in his commentary, writes this: chapters like Ezra 2 are among the most uninviting portions of the Bible to the modern reader because of their tedious nature and because of their overtones of racial exclusivism and pride. When he makes a statement like that, I think he's insulting us, mostly, if I could assume, all of you. I read these passages. As a matter of fact, Mickey makes sure I read them because he gives them to me to preach. So I do read them, and I have to say that at first glance it does seem like a tedious list of names, and by reading it several times, some pieces begin to fall into place. And when I get to a section like this, I always remember what Paul wrote to Timothy. He said, all Scripture is inspired by God, profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work. All Scripture. And when he was writing that, he was speaking about what we call the Old Testament. So this is part of the inspired Word of God. And I'm convinced that when I come to a passage like this that at first glance I find tedious, or wonder why in the world God threw a genealogy in the middle of a couple of real exciting stories, that it's because I'm missing something. And I begin to look at the passage, and I have never studied a genealogy or a passage like this without having it result in a blessing and some excitement. So I want to look at an overview of this chapter. It's a very long chapter. Just pick out a couple of key things that happen in this chapter. First of all, I'm glad that we took the time to study the book of Genesis, because it is the foundation for all things. And two of the main ideas that came up over and over again in the book of Genesis were the people that God chose and the land that God chose. They come up over and over and over again. God promised the people, Jewish people, through Abraham, that the Messiah would come through them. It was very important. This was the redemption for the world in God's plan. The people of Israel were very important to him. And keeping the line clean was important to God. You think about how God was concerned about the nation of Israel and keeping them as a separate people. He wanted the Messiah to come through them. He made that promise. And if the Jewish people kind of dispersed and were gone, how do we even know One of the signs that we know that Jesus is the promised Messiah is because he's Jewish. So God promised many years ago. You remember twice, Abraham went down into Egypt. Abraham went to Gerar with Abimelech. Remember both times he lied about his wife? Sarah, obviously, without reading into the text, but reading between the lines, she was a real babe. And both these kings wanted her. Came into town and said, I want this chick. She's available. She's somebody's sister. Let's go talk. We'll make a deal. What did God do? Both times he protected Sarah. Why? Because it was important that the line be kept clean, because the Messiah was promised to come through him. And just think, in the very beginning, Abraham and Sarah, the beginning of the line of the Jewish people. If the line got messed up there, it was finished forever. So God protects over and over again. And the other idea he has in there is the land of Israel. He promised the land to Abraham. He says in Genesis, again, 13, we studied this. The Lord said to Abram after Lot separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, westward. For all the land you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. I'll make your descendants as the dust of the earth. So if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can be numbered. Arise and walk through the land, its length and breadth, for I give it to you. God promised that land to Abraham. We see it repeated several times to Abraham. We see it promised to Isaac, his son, to Jacob, his grandson. God promised this people that he was going to keep separate. They would have their own land. And God shows his concern for his promise and his love and his people, because the people started to drift away a little bit, and God brings in a judgment. He has them sent to Babylon. Judgment comes in the form of King Nebuchadnezzar. The people continually turned away from God, and ultimately God said, I haven't got your attention by giving you crops. I haven't got your attention by protecting you. I haven't got you to appreciate me by blessing you. So now I want to get your attention by having you carried away into exile. Nebuchadnezzar comes in, he destroys and captures the people. Only the poorest people of the land were left, and destroyed the temple. He took all the wealth of Israel into Babylon. And humanly speaking, that should have been the end of the Jewish people, especially in those days. In the ancient world, when a country was captured, the people were all taken out of the country to a foreign place, and they mixed in with the population of the conquering country. People would either intermarry or they would be raped, and it would take away their unique identity. Imagine if someone took over the United States and they sent us all over to, I don't want to name any particular country because I don't want to cause a problem, but to any other place in the world, and we stayed there. We were there for several generations. What's going to happen with our children and our children's children? And after a while, and you see, even when God through Cyrus calls people back into the land of Israel, most of them didn't go. You know why? Because they were making a decent living and they had settled in. They didn't want to go back. It was the plan, I think, of the evil one to keep them there. But it's not just a plan in the ancient world. I mean, it happens even in this time. If you remember, in 1990 is the Bosnian War. Remember one of the worst war crimes there? There was ritualized, systematic rape of women. It says, this is from an article I read, while men of all ethnic groups committed rape, the great majority of rapes were perpetrated by Bosnian Serb forces who used genocidal rape as an instrument of terror and as part of their program of ethnic cleansing. They did that. And they did it because they wanted to wipe out the race. Because now your children are not your children anymore. So we see that what normally would be the death of a nation is not so in the case of Israel, because God was intervening over them. I'll read a couple of verses. Just in verse 1, listen to, in light of all these things, think how incredible this verse is in Ezra 1. Chapter 2, it says, now these are the people of the province, these are people of Judah, who came up out of the captivity of the exiles, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away to Babylon. And they returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his own city. Think about how incredible that is. This is the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed everything, took the people away, planned on them blending in, and they come back to the land that God had promised them. And not just them, they returned to cities they came from. And in verse 2 it says, these came with Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Seraiah, Realiah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum, and Baanah. He gives specific names of the people coming back. First is Zerubbabel. He should have been the king in Israel. He was a direct descendant from the line of David, but he could not serve as king because there was a curse in his line. The curse on Jeconiah. It says, Jeremiah 22, it says, no offspring of Conaniah would sit on the throne, even though he was destined to be the king. And it's an incredibly interesting story of how this king is cursed, and then the argument about whether the curse is removed or not. And it's really interesting, and I'm not going to tell you anything about it. I'm going to tell you to look that up yourself, because we'll be here for a long time. But the story of King Jeconiah, and the key phrase in that search is signet ring. If you look up Jeconiah, you look up signet ring, you'll see how this plays out all the way up to the genealogy of Jesus that's listed in Matthew and in Luke. Absolutely incredible. We see these things, all these pieces of the puzzle fitting together. Ezra mentions Jeshua or Joshua or Yeshua or Yehoshua, as many people say today. He was the high priest, first high priest to return to the land of Israel. And we won't go through all these names and places, but Ezra's chapter 2 talks about people and their descendants. He talks about the people who return. He lists the priests. And think about what's happening. These people are returning from captivity from Persia. They're coming back into Israel to rebuild the temple. What do? They bring back some important leaders, which is crucial, and they bring back the priests. Why? They're going to rebuild the temple. They want to restore worship to the true God of Israel. So they brought priests back. And it lists many different priests, but in verse 41, we find a name you might be familiar with, the sons of Asaph. Asaph was a writer of psalms. He was a songwriter, a friend of David, served in the temple when David was in Jerusalem. Then it was the tabernacle. He wrote 12 different psalms. He's mentioned all throughout Scripture. And I don't know if I want to say this publicly. I don't want to get in an argument with anybody. But I think Asaph's psalms might be better than David's. I'm not saying they are. But when you read through, Asaph talks about God being the shepherd, the people of Israel being the sheep, and how God watches over. It's incredible. You see the real love. And Asaph writes about this. This is generations later, probably about 400 years after Asaph died. We still see his descendants. Not only are they known, they're known to be his descendants. Can you imagine that? 400 years later. They come, and they still know them. It's like in our time, if you could trace your family back, I figured approximately to like 1550. I know some of my family. I'm probably glad I don't know all of them, but can you imagine? Like this is over almost 500 years before. The people, all the history that happened, including the captivity taken away, they come back, they still know exactly who they are. That is pretty amazing in that time, in that culture. We see the sons of Solomon in there, the servants. And then Ezra mentions something unique in verse 58. All the temple servants and the sons of Solomon's servants were 392. The temple servants are believed to be the descendants of the Gibeonites. In Numbers, it tells us a story of the Gibeonites. Another very interesting story, but this time I'll tell you. Can we have the map of the conquest of Canaan? Okay, Mickey, I'm sorry, I have a regular pointer. You see, it's not as clear as I thought it would be, but here's Jericho, and Ai and Gibeon right here. See? So it's Jericho, Ai, Gibeon, right? You see that little line right in the beginning of the country. You remember under Joshua when the people were going into the land, remember the story of Rahab? Rahab tells the spies that come in to look over the land to get ready for the invasion. Rahab says to them, listen, the dread of you is over the entire country. We know, we've heard the stories. We heard how the people of Israel came out of Egypt. We heard how God delivered them out of Egypt. We heard of your military victories all through the way. And you come into the land, they're coming into Jericho, and the people are frightened to death because they've seen Israel have victory and victory and victory, and they see this army coming towards them. They defeat Jericho. They defeat Ai, and once they defeat Ai, they're going to next run through the town of Gibeon. The Gibeonites handle things a little bit different than all the surrounding people. They decided their best bet was to send an envoy to Joshua and his soldiers, and they're going to scam him. That's really what they did. They're going to scam this guy because he's coming in. They know they don't stand a chance. And here's what happens in Joshua 9:3. It says, however, when the people of Gibeon heard that Joshua, what they had done to Jericho and Ai, right? They heard. The word's out. It says, they resorted to a ruse, which sounds to me like an Ed Norton word, if you remember Ed Norton. Anyway, they resorted to a clever ruse. And they went as a delegation whose donkeys, listen to what they did, were loaded with worn-out sacks and old wineskins and cracked and mended. They put on worn and patched sandals on their feet, and they wore old clothes, and all their bread or their food supply was dry and moldy. You see, so this is what they do. They know that Joshua has gone through Jericho, through Ai, he's coming to Gibeon, which is the next town. So what do? The leaders of the town got together and said, listen, here's what we're going to do. We want you to get all the old bread, the old wineskins, put on old clothes, to everything. And they go to Joshua, and it said, this is what they said in Joshua. Then they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal on the way, and they said to him and the Israelites, we've come from a distant country. Make a treaty with us. You know, we came a long way from here. We heard how you guys are doing. We want you to make a deal with us that you're not going to hurt us. And it says the leader of Israel did not consult with God, but promised they would be kept safe. And when they found out they were tricked, it was too late because they had already given their word. He said, make a deal with us. Don't attack us. Don't harm us. And Joshua and the leader said, yeah, okay, no problem. Then they find out that the Gibeonites had tricked them, that they had lied. And it was too late because they already made a promise. So Joshua says, he summoned the Gibeonites and said, why did you deceive us by saying we live a long way from you when you actually live near us? You are now under a curse. You'll never be released. You'll never be released from service as woodcutters and water carriers for the house of my God. See, Joshua said, okay, you tricked us. We're going to keep our word, but I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to have you draw the water, cut the lumber for the fires and the sacrifices and everything forever for the temple. And they answered Joshua and said, hey, your servants were clearly told how the Lord your God commanded his servant Moses to give you the whole land and wipe out the inhabitants before you. So we feared of our lives. That's why we did this. We are now in your hands. Do whatever seems good. And Joshua saved them from the Israelites, and they did not kill them. They made the Gibeonites woodcutters and water carriers for the assembly to provide for the needs of the altar at the place where the Lord would choose. And that is what they are to this day. And what do we see? People, they went into exile too because the Babylonians didn't care. Are you Jewish? Yeah. Are you? No. Oh, you could say. Gibeonites, they were just part of the society, and Nebuchadnezzar took them all. But years later, they come back into the land. They're still identified as descendants of the Gibeonites. And why would they come back too? Because they were the servants for the temple. The ones who got the water and the wood for the sacrifices, all these things. So we see that God kept them also, and they came back. So the priests came back. The Levites came back. And then we see the Gibeonites came back as well to serve in the temple. And then Ezra, after telling us this, he gives us a couple verses in there that says some people returned that couldn't prove that they were Jewish. They didn't know their ancestors. That's a big deal. Why? Jewish people, promised Messiah. You know, they let them come, and they came and they joined, but they had no proof of who they were. Similar problem with the priests. Some of the priests came back and couldn't prove who they were. They were removed from the priesthood until the matter, it says, could be settled by the Urim and the Thummim. The Urim and the Thummim were kept in the high priest breastplate. So if we have the picture of the breastplate. Now let me tell you first of all that nobody in the world, I don't care who you read and who you see online, who knows what it really was. The Urim and Thummim. Nobody knows exactly what they are. And this is merely one of the conjectures that, you know, the high priest wore this breastplate on top of his ephod. He had an ephod, a linen ephod, almost like an over-the-shoulder apron type thing that went over when he was serving in the temple. In the center, he had the breastplate. In the breastplate were the 12 stones, which were representative for each one of the 12 tribes. And somebody believes that this stone, they were the Urim and the Thummim. And it was kind of a way of casting lots. If we could have the other picture of this says on the left, the right Thummim, and on the left Urim. It means lights and perfections. So that it was used as a way to cast lots. That's how they got an answer from God. They did get an answer from God. King David consulted them. Moses, I don't know how they worked, and nobody really does. But these guys said, we're not really sure if some of these people claiming to be priests should be priests, so we're going to sideline them until we get an answer from God. And that's why these things come up. But nobody's exactly sure what it is. And there's one other detail in this section that I would like to cover, and that's in verse 61. This is an unusual thing. It says, of the sons of the priests, the sons of Habiah, the sons of Hakaz, the sons of Barzillai, who took a wife from the daughters of Barzillai the Gileadite, and was called by their name. Now, that's an unusual thing, because we see most of the time in the scriptures, the genealogy goes from father to son to son to son, but there was a problem. And here we see this man who claimed he was a priest married into the family of Barzillai and took that family name, which means now the genealogy went through his wife. That's unusual. We see the reason for this in the book of Numbers. This is another book that's often skipped over that has a couple of really interesting things. What happened was Moses, you know what, maybe we could put the 12 tribes up there where the land is divided. When the people of Israel went into the land, Moses gave them instructions. Each part of the land belonged to different tribes. We have Ephraim, we have Manasseh, Reuben. So the land was divided up into the different tribes. So what happened was, as they were going into the land, there was a little problem. And this is what Moses records. He says, the daughters of Zelophehad, Mala, Noah, Holgan, Milcah, and Tirzah, came to speak with Moses and the leaders of the congregation. So they're getting ready to go they're in the land, and they're getting ready to get their inheritance. And these daughters of Zelophehad, the father died, and it said, our father died in the wilderness, yet not because he was among the company of those who gathered themselves against the Lord in the company of Korah, but died in his own sins, and he had no sons. So some people were struck down because they rebelled against Moses, and these girls come to Moses and say, look, our father's dead. Not because he was a rebel, but he died in his own sin. He died of natural causes of old age. And then he said, why should the name of our father be withdrawn from among his family because he had no son? Give us a possession among our father's brothers. So they just come to Moses and say, look, we know that the land's handed down from father to son. Our father had no sons. Why do we get cut out of the whole deal? We should get something. We are his family. We're his daughters. And Moses brought the case before the Lord. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, the daughters of Zelophehad are right in their statements. You shall surely give them a hereditary possession among their father's brothers, and you shall transfer the inheritance of their father to them. You see, what he's saying is that okay, these girls are right, they deserve something. And I know it goes father, son, but here there are no sons, so the inheritance is now transferred over to the daughters. That's what God told Moses. That became a law in Israel. And I sometimes we hear people say that, God gets a bad rap. He treats women worse than men. It's not really true. It's not true. If we begin to look at different situations and look at them carefully, look what happened in this case. These women were going to be left pretty much destitute, left without anything. And they come to Moses. What does Moses do? Moses goes to God and he says to them, hey, these girls are right. They deserve the inheritance. You give it to them. And that's what began to happen. So now you see the genealogy goes through the men, but here it's transferred over. The inheritance goes down to the women now because there were no sons, which is an interesting thing. Now, a couple chapters later, there's a little bit of a battle that goes on because some of the men come and they say to Moses, look, if we have a daughter that has no brothers and she's in, let's say she's in the tribe of Dan and she marries somebody from Ephraim and her inheritance is from her is kept by her, but then it goes with her and her husband, we're going to lose pieces of the land. So eventually what's going to happen is this map's going to be all messed up because people from different tribes, women from different tribes are going to marry people from other different tribes. And, they said it's going to be a crazy situation. So God said, look, I'll tell you what. The women own everything as long as they marry within their own tribe. That way we'll keep everything straight. And that's what began to happen in Israel. If there was a man that had no sons, what happened is that the inheritance was given to the daughter, and it belonged to her. And we also see that what started to happen too is sometimes the genealogy went through the woman as well. It happened in King David's own family, his sister Zeruiah. When you read through the scripture, sometimes it will say the sons of Zeruiah. Well, she was a woman. Why? Because the genealogy was transferred. And this whole issue, it's interesting because it's mentioned in Joshua, it comes up again in Ezra, and it also comes up again in the genealogy of Jesus in Luke chapter 3. And again, that's an incredibly interesting thing, but I'm not going to tell you anything about that. You have to look it up yourself. But think for a second, what would happen? When we read the genealogies, there's a lot, some things are just confusing. We have two genealogies that are totally different. We believe one is from Joseph, his father, the other is from Mary, his mother. When you look through the genealogies, it gives two different fathers for Joseph, the husband of Mary. And why is that? What about if Mary had no brothers? What about if Mary received her father's inheritance? What about if Joseph was brought into that family, just like Barzillai was brought into that family as well? It's an interesting thing. And you see the pieces of evidence that we never would have thought about come from Joshua and come from Ezra. And you can piece all these things together to see God's plan and God's working. So we have this, and Ezra finishes up the chapter with a list of the goods that the people brought back and the priests and the Levites going into their own city. So it's an interesting chapter with a lot of interesting things that are in there that we ordinarily on first glance, man, I got to skip over this. Yeah, blah, 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 blah. Let's get back to the action. But there's interesting things in there that we could see the hand of God working over time. A couple of quick thoughts about this chapter. The first, God's promises are always kept. And we saw that in Genesis over and over again. I don't know where you are in your life, but sometimes it just seems like God forgot, or you ain't getting it, or however it feels to you. God's promises are kept sometimes out of impossible situations. You think about what was happening here. These people in the ancient world carried away to a foreign place. The goal of Nebuchadnezzar was to remove them from their land and any memory of their land, and also to mix them into the people. People that come here, we all know, the current phrase, I'm going to depoliticize this, we're all children of immigrants. after a generation. I have really good friends of mine whose parents came from other countries. They've never been there. They have no idea what it's like. My grandparents both, on my mother's side, came from Sicily. We went this summer to go visit the town. I saw the house where my grandfather was born and where he lived as a boy. I don't know much about the culture. I know the culture from my grandparents. I don't know much about it. As time goes on, you imagine these people were there 70 years. That's like 2 generations at least. People forget. They don't know. That's Nebuchadnezzar's thing. A couple generations, who's going to remember what? That's why most of them didn't want to go back. It wasn't home to them. Israel wasn't home to the grandchildren of these people, just like our grandchildren. Italy's not my home. I could like it, but America's my home. That's what Nebuchadnezzar wanted to happen to these people. A couple generations, they would forget who they were. And they would not want the land. But God promised them the land. And God brought them back to the land, just like he promised, because it was theirs for all time. And sometimes I hear people say, well, when the people came back, they really weren't obedient to God. They really didn't learn their lesson. They don't deserve the promise that God made. And when I hear that kind of stuff, it makes me tremble, because I don't deserve the promises that God made to me. If you're really honest, if we look at the great promises that God made, what makes you, me, us so great? Yeah, you owe me. No. It's because of the character and nature of God that he keeps his promises. That's why he keeps them to us. It's not because we used to be bad and now we're good. Or not, we used to be good and now we're better. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the character and nature of God. God brought them back because he said, in this time, in this day, in this way, I will bring you back. Out of an impossible situation, a place where people didn't even remember, and many people didn't want to come back, God kept his promise to the people. And, it makes me think, too, that there's a number of people today who say that God's special, unique relationship with the nation of Israel is finished. That God used the Jewish people to bring the Messiah. He kept the lines clean, brought them. When the Messiah came, people say the people rejected Jesus as Messiah, which is not really true. The religious leadership rejected Jesus as Messiah. But there were many Jewish people that accepted him. How about the apostles? How about the writers of the New Testament? How about the 3,000 that came to faith in one day of Pentecost? They didn't reject Jesus as Messiah. The religious leaders did. But God has not rejected the Jewish people. And I thought about it. I told a friend of mine, he wasn't impressed about this as me, but what happened in 1948? Israel was reestablished as a nation, right? Israel was reestablished as a nation. I understand there's human elements in there, which that's the way God works, but it was an unbelievable miracle. An ancient land was reestablished, and an ancient people were called back to that land. And you look, the people that are living in Israel now come from all over the world. Literally, they were scattered, just like they were during the Babylonian exile. They were scattered before World War II, but people have come back from everywhere in the land. My good friend Dan lives there. His parents come from France. There's so many Americans. You always hear American accent when people speak Hebrew, or people, and I bust their chops sometimes. We have some of the guys give us a hard time about some of the things we believe, and I bust their chops because I know where they are. I had a nice, friendly East-West Coast argument with a guy from California who's an Israeli living there. He came from California to live there. We were going into Hezekiah's tunnel, which is a tunnel that Hezekiah built to bring water into the city, and now you can go through there. I've been through there 3 times, and I've been petrified all 3 times on account. It's really deep, it's really dark, it's way underground, it's very narrow, and I only have one thought in my head, and that's earthquake. But I went with a lot of college kids, and they all go, so I have to pretend I don't care, and I'm going to go. But we're going into the entrance of Hezekiah's tunnel, and I hear this guy talking, and I knew right away where he was from. My sister married a guy from County Cork in Ireland, and they have a different kind of accent, people from County Cork. I'd know it anywhere. And I hear this guy, he's working, they sell you flashlights so you can go in the tunnel, and you're only semi-petrified. But this guy's selling flashlights, and I hear him talking. And I said to him, "Are you from County Cork?" Yeah, I am. Yeah, why? He felt a draw to go back to the land of Israel. God promised the people the land, and they come. And we see, too, that the people that are going back today, 2019, they still know they're Jewish. Isn't that weird? God's protected these people. They know who they are. They come home. This is a homeland for them. For us to return, many of us to return to the place where our ancestors came from, we might feel a little out of place. We might take a while. People that go back to Israel, they feel like they went home. That's a unique thing that God did in the hearts of these people. So God promised them the land. Ezra 2, coming back to the land. God promised to keep them as a unique people. And God brought them back in Ezra as unique people. Incredible. And one other thing I wanted to mention is just the tediousness of the names. God knows everyone by name. I know I mentioned it before. That boggles my mind. God mentions the people by name and their families by name. Remember the line in the song from Cheers? You want to go where everybody knows your name? Yeah, you know why? It feels good, don't it? God knows you, me, everyone, believers, unbelievers, good, bad. He knows everyone by name. You don't have to go anywhere. God already knows. Just like he put the tedious list in there because it's important to him, each person. It's if he had a modern one, he might say that he knows Truman, the father of Mickey, the father of Michael. That's how God looks at it. It's important to him. And not to mention, I mean, just in closing, think about this. You having your name be known to God. What better place than to have your name be known to God than in the Lamb's Book of Life? You ever think about that? Individually, your name. You never read through the Lamb's Book of Life and think it's a tedious list, would you? I mean, honestly, isn't it? It's the most incredible thing. It's beyond belief and beyond comprehension. Person comes to faith and they're written in the book of life. That's absolutely incredible. People, individuals, like these people here are important to God, just like we are. And I think it's really encouraging, no matter what your personal situation is, you can take the promises of God at full face value. They will be done because of who he is. It's not a matter of you're being good enough to get them. It's a matter of God is good enough to make them. That's really what's important. And the second thing is that this idea of the land of Israel, it's a huge deal to God. It's always been a huge deal to God. It's a place he chose. Why? I have no idea, but that's what he chose. And, lastly, you feel a little lonely, you feel discouraged, you feel, not so worthy. God knows your name, and it's important to him.